The morning sun cast long shadows across the parking lot of the Rocky Mountain National Park Visitor Center as Sarah Chen adjusted her hiking boots for the third time. It was October 15th, 1994, and the aspen leaves had turned a brilliant gold, creating a canopy of light that filtered through the crisp Colorado air. At 23, Sarah was meticulous about everything: her gear, her routes, her backup plans. That's what made her such a perfect hiking partner for Jessica Martinez, who was the complete opposite: spontaneous, adventurous, and always ready to take the path less traveled. "You sure you packed enough granola bars?" Jessica teased, watching Sarah reorganize her backpack for the fourth time. "We're only going for 3 days, not 3 weeks. Her dark eyes sparkled with the kind of mischief that had gotten them both into trouble and out of it since their freshman year at Colorado State University. Sarah laughed, the sound echoing off the mountains that surrounded them. "You know me too well. But seriously, Jess, this new GPS unit is going to change everything. No more getting lost like last summer." She held up the small rectangular device, a Garmin E-Trex, one of the first consumer GPS units available. It had cost her nearly $600, almost her entire savings from her summer job at the campus bookstore. Before we continue with Sarah and Jessica's story, I want to ask you to take a moment to subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. Your support means everything to us. And please drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from. Whether you're joining us from Denver, New York, or somewhere across the globe, we love hearing from our community of mystery enthusiasts. Jessica shouldered her own pack, significantly lighter and less organized than Sarah's. "As long as that thing doesn't lead us off a cliff, I'm all for it. Though honestly, some of my best adventures have come from getting a little lost." She glanced at the trail map posted near the entrance. "So remind me again why we're not taking the standard Bear Lake Trail like everyone else." "Because," Sarah said, her voice dropping to an excited whisper, "I've been researching this area for months. There's an old mining trail that connects to the main network, but it's not on any of the current maps. I found references to it in some 1920s geological surveys at the library. It should cut our hiking time by almost a day and take us through some pristine wilderness that most people never see." The two women made an unlikely pair. Sarah, with her straight black hair, always pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her preference for earth-tone clothing, approached life like a research project. Every decision was carefully considered, every risk calculated. Jessica, meanwhile, had inherited her grandmother's wild curls and her father's restless spirit. She wore bright colors even on hiking trails and had a laugh that could be heard from 3 campsites away. They had met during orientation week at CSU, assigned as roommates in a dormitory mix-up that the housing office later admitted was a mistake. Sarah had requested a quiet, studious roommate, while Jessica had asked for someone fun and outgoing. But something clicked between the serious pre-med student and the free-spirited art major. Sarah helped Jessica pass organic chemistry. Jessica taught Sarah how to salsa dance and convinced her to take painting classes as electives. Now, 3 years after graduation, they were both trying to figure out their places in the world. Sarah was working at a medical research lab in Denver, saving money for graduate school. Jessica had been traveling, picking up freelance graphic design work where she could find it, but she'd been staying with Sarah for the past 2 months, ostensibly to get her life together. "You know what I love about you, Sarah?" Jessica said as they signed the trail register, their signatures the last entries on a page that would soon be filed away in a dusty administrative office. "You make getting lost sound like a scientific expedition." "And you make scientific expeditions feel like adventures," Sarah replied, checking her compass one more time. "That's why we work." They set off on the marked trail first, their boots crunching on fallen leaves and the occasional patch of early snow that hadn't yet melted in the shadows. The air was thin and clean, carrying the scent of pine and the faint sweetness of aspen bark. Other hikers passed them going in both directions, families with young children heading to easier destinations, serious backpackers loaded down with gear for extended trips, day hikers like themselves out to enjoy the perfect autumn weather. After about 2 miles, Sarah consulted her handwritten notes and the GPS unit. Okay, this is where it gets interesting. According to my research, there should be an unmarked trail splitting off to the north right around here. She studied the device's small screen, frowning slightly. The GPS is showing our location, but there aren't any trail maps loaded yet. This technology is still pretty new. They spent 20 minutes searching through the undergrowth before Jessica spotted what looked like a faint path disappearing into a grove of aspen trees. "This has to be it," she called out. "Look, you can see where people have walked before. The vegetation is different." Sarah hurried over, pulling out a magnifying glass to examine the ground more closely. "You're right. And see this." She pointed to a small pile of rocks that seemed deliberately arranged. "This looks like an old trail marker." The path was narrow and overgrown in places, but it was definitely a path. It wound uphill through dense forest, crossing small streams on logs that looked like they'd been placed decades ago. The deeper they went, the quieter the woods became. The sounds of other hikers faded away, replaced by the whisper of wind through pine needles and the distant call of a hawk circling overhead. "Sarah, look at this," Jessica said, stopping beside what appeared to be the remnants of an old wooden structure. "This must be from the mining days you were talking about." They explored the ruins, just a few rotting planks and some rusted metal, but unmistakably human-made. Sarah photographed everything with her film camera, taking careful notes about their location and the GPS coordinates. "This is incredible. We might be the first people to document this site in decades." As the afternoon wore on, the trail became increasingly difficult to follow. What had started as a clear path branched and split, with some routes disappearing entirely into thick underbrush. Sarah tried to use the GPS to backtrack to their last known position, but the device seemed to be having trouble maintaining a satellite signal under the dense forest canopy. "Maybe we should head back," Sarah suggested, though her voice carried a note of reluctance. The researcher in her was fascinated by what they were discovering. "We can come back another day, with better equipment." "Are you kidding?" Jessica's eyes were bright with excitement. "This is like finding buried treasure. We're probably the first people to come this way in 50 years. Look around. It's absolutely beautiful." She was right. They had emerged into a small meadow surrounded by towering peaks, the kind of pristine wilderness that seemed to exist only in postcards. A stream meandered through the center, its water crystal clear and so cold it made their teeth ache when they stopped to drink. Wildflowers that had somehow survived the early autumn cold dotted the grass like scattered gems. "Okay," Sarah conceded. "But we camp here tonight, and we start back first thing in the morning. I want to be back on the main trail before sunset tomorrow." They set up their tent in a sheltered spot near the stream, using rocks to anchor the stakes in the hard ground. Jessica gathered firewood while Sarah prepared their dinner, freeze-dried pasta that tasted better than it had any right to in the thin mountain air. As darkness fell, they sat beside their small campfire, watching stars appear in numbers that city dwellers rarely see. "I've been thinking," Jessica said, her voice thoughtful in a way that was unusual for her. "About what I want to do with my life, I mean. Being out here, away from everything, it makes things clearer somehow." Sarah looked at her friend's face in the firelight. "What kind of things?" "I think I want to teach, not in a regular classroom, but outdoors. Environmental education, maybe wilderness therapy. There are programs starting up that work with troubled kids, taking them into nature to help them find themselves. Jessica poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling up into the darkness. I know it sounds crazy coming from me. It doesn't sound crazy at all, Sarah said. It sounds perfect, actually. You have this way of making people feel like they can do anything. Remember when you convinced me to try rock climbing last year? I was terrified, but you made it seem like the most natural thing in the world. They talked until late, sharing dreams and fears and the kind of deep conversations that only happen around campfires in the middle of nowhere. Finally, as the fire burned down to glowing embers, they retreated to their tent, falling asleep to the sound of wind moving through the pines and the distant hooting of an owl. Sarah woke first, as she always did, and stepped outside to greet a morning that looked like it belonged in a travel magazine. The meadow was covered with frost that sparkled like diamonds in the early sunlight, and the peaks around them glowed pink and gold in the alpine light. She started coffee on their portable stove and was organizing gear when Jessica emerged from the tent, her hair looking like she'd been wrestling with bears. "Please tell me you made coffee," Jessica mumbled, rubbing her eyes. "And please tell me it's stronger than yesterday's." They broke camp efficiently, their movements synchronized by years of hiking together. Sarah checked the GPS unit and frowned. "That's weird. It's not picking up any satellites this morning." The signal was spotty yesterday, but it worked. "Technology," Jessica said with a shrug. "That's why I still carry a compass and paper maps. Speaking of which," she pulled out her topographical map and spread it on a flat rock. "If we're where I think we are, we should be able to follow this stream down and intersect with the main trail system somewhere around here." She pointed to a spot on the map. Sarah studied the map and compared it with her notes. "That makes sense. And look, there's a ranger station marked about 5 miles downstream. If we get confused, we can ask for directions there." They shouldered their packs and set off, following the stream as it wound its way down through the forest. The going was easier than the previous day, even though they weren't on an established trail. The stream provided a clear path, and the morning was crisp and beautiful. But as the hours passed, Sarah began to feel uneasy. The landscape around them didn't match what she expected to see based on the map. The peaks were in the wrong positions, the forest was denser than it should have been, and they hadn't encountered any of the landmarks that should have appeared along their route. "Jess," she said during their lunch break, "I think we might have made a wrong turn somewhere." Jessica consulted the map again, turning it in different directions, as if that might make their surroundings make more sense. "You might be right, but look, we're definitely going downhill, and all these streams eventually lead to civilization, right? Worst case scenario, we hike an extra day." Sarah wasn't convinced, but Jessica's optimism was infectious, and the afternoon was too beautiful for serious worry. They continued downstream, stopping to photograph interesting rock formations and to collect samples of unusual plants that Sarah wanted to identify later. The GPS remained stubbornly silent, unable to acquire the satellite signals it needed to function. As evening approached, they found themselves in a narrow canyon with steep walls on both sides. The stream had carved a deep channel through the rock, creating a series of small waterfalls and pools that would have been stunning under other circumstances. But now, with daylight fading and no clear way out of the canyon, Sarah felt the first real stirrings of anxiety. "We need to find a place to camp," she said, trying to keep her voice calm. "And tomorrow we need to seriously consider turning around and retracing our steps." They found a small level area beside one of the pools, barely large enough for their tent. As they set up camp, Jessica maintained her usual cheerful chatter, but Sarah noticed that her friends' jokes had a forced quality to them, and she kept glancing up at the canyon walls as if measuring their height. That night, for the first time in their years of hiking together, neither of them slept well. The third day dawned grey and cold, with low clouds obscuring the peaks above them. Sarah's anxiety had crystallized into something approaching panic. They had been hiking for almost 2 full days since leaving the established trail, and nothing, not the terrain, not the vegetation, not even the quality of light, looked familiar or matched any of the landmarks on their maps. "Sarah, hey!" Jessica's voice was gentle but firm. "Look at me." She waited until her friend met her eyes. "We're going to be fine. We're experienced hikers. We have plenty of supplies, and people know where we were supposed to be. If we don't show up when planned, search teams will come looking." Sarah nodded, taking a deep breath of the thin mountain air. Jessica was right, of course. They had filed their hiking plan with the ranger station, listing their intended route and expected return date. When they failed to check out tomorrow as scheduled, rangers would begin searching the areas where they were supposed to be. But that was exactly the problem. They weren't where they were supposed to be. They continued down the canyon, hoping it would eventually open up and provide them with some recognizable landmarks. The walls gradually grew higher, and the stream became more turbulent, cascading over boulders in a series of rapids that made conversation difficult. Sarah tried the GPS repeatedly throughout the day, but it remained dead, its small screen blank and unhelpful. In the late afternoon, they encountered their first serious obstacle, a waterfall about 20 feet high, plunging into a pool that blocked the entire width of the canyon. There was no obvious way around it. The walls were too steep and slippery to climb safely. "Well," Jessica said, studying the situation, "I guess this is where we find out how good those rock climbing lessons were." They spent an hour rigging a rope system that would allow them to rappel down beside the waterfall. Sarah's hands shook as she checked and rechecked the anchors, while Jessica tested every knot with the thoroughness of someone whose life depended on them holding. Finally, with Sarah belaying from above, Jessica made the descent, her movements careful and controlled despite her usual impulsive nature. "Your turn," Jessica called from below, her voice barely audible over the noise of falling water. "Take your time. The rock's a little slippery near the bottom." Sarah had rappelled before, but never in conditions like these, and never when so much depended on getting it right. She eased over the edge, feeling the rope take her weight, and began the controlled fall that would bring her down to where Jessica waited. Halfway down, something went wrong. Later, neither of them could say exactly what happened. Perhaps a piece of rock broke loose, or maybe Sarah's foot slipped on the wet stone. All Jessica saw from below was her best friend suddenly swinging toward the canyon wall, the rope burning through the belay device too fast to control. Sarah struck the rock face hard, her helmet cracking against granite, and then dropped the remaining 8 feet into the pool at the base of the waterfall. Jessica plunged in after her, fighting the current and the shocking cold of snowmelt water to reach her friend, who was floating face down and motionless. She dragged Sarah to the rocky shore, her training from a wilderness first aid course kicking in automatically. Sarah was breathing but unconscious, with a deep gash on her forehead and her left arm bent at an unnatural angle. Jessica used their emergency kit to clean and bandage the head wound, then fashioned a crude splint for what was obviously a broken arm. For the next 6 hours, she kept a vigil beside her unconscious friend, checking her pulse and breathing, trying to keep her warm with their shared sleeping bag, and fighting down the panic that threatened to overwhelm her rational thinking. When Sarah finally opened her eyes as darkness was falling, Jessica nearly cried with relief. "What happened?" Sarah's voice was weak and confused. "My head feels like someone hit it with a hammer." "You fell," Jessica explained gently. "Do you remember rappelling down the waterfall?" Sarah tried to sit up, then immediately lay back down with a groan. "No, I remember setting up the ropes, and then nothing." She looked at her splintered arm as if seeing it for the first time. "Is it broken?" "I think so. But you're awake and talking, which is the important thing." Jessica helped her friend sip water from their bottles. "Sarah, we need to talk about our situation. You need medical attention, and we're completely lost." They spent the night huddled together for warmth, taking turns sleeping while the other kept watch. Sarah's condition seemed stable, but she was obviously in pain and having trouble staying focused for more than a few minutes at a time. The head injury had affected her short-term memory. She kept asking the same questions and seemed genuinely surprised each time Jessica told her about the fall. Morning brought no improvement in either Sarah's condition or their circumstances. If anything, the canyon had become even more confining, with walls that rose almost vertically on both sides and no visible way out, except to continue following the stream or to attempt the dangerous climb back up the waterfall. "I think we should try to get back up," Sarah said, though her voice lacked conviction. "Retrace our steps." Jessica looked at the waterfall, then at her injured friend. "Sarah, you can barely walk, and you have a head injury. There's no way you can climb back up there even with my help." They were trapped, and they both knew it. Jessica made the decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She would leave Sarah in their makeshift camp with most of their supplies and follow the stream alone, moving as quickly as possible to find help. Sarah was in no condition to travel, but she might survive for several days if Jessica could bring back a rescue team. "I'll mark the route as I go," Jessica promised, tying bright bandanas to trees and stacking rocks in obvious cairns. "The rescue team will be able to follow my trail back to you." Sarah tried to object, but she was getting weaker, and they both knew that time was critical. Jessica left her with the tent, most of their food and water, all their warm clothing, and the GPS unit. Even though it wasn't working, it might provide some useful information to rescuers. "I'll be back," Jessica said, kissing her friend's forehead gently. "I promise. Just stay here and stay warm, and I'll bring help." Oh, she set off downstream at first light, moving faster than she ever had in the mountains, driven by desperation and the knowledge that Sarah's life might depend on how quickly she could find civilization. The canyon walls gradually began to recede, and the stream widened, giving her hope that she was finally heading in the right direction. But as the day wore on, the landscape became increasingly unfamiliar and threatening. The stream split and rejoined repeatedly, creating a maze of channels that made it impossible to know which route to follow. Jessica left markers at every junction, but she began to realize that she was creating a trail too complex for anyone to follow back. As night fell, she was forced to admit that she was as lost as Sarah, perhaps more so. She had no tent, limited supplies, and no clear idea of where she was or how to get back to her injured friend. She spent the night huddled under a pine tree, shivering and planning her next move. The next morning, Jessica made a decision that saved her life but would torment her forever. Instead of trying to find her way back to Sarah, she continued downstream, reasoning that the creek would eventually lead to a road or a town or some kind of civilization. She told herself that bringing back professional rescuers was still the best hope for saving her friend. 3 days later, dehydrated and exhausted, Jessica stumbled onto a Forest Service road and flagged down a maintenance truck. The driver, a grizzled Forest Service employee named Bill Morrison, took one look at her condition and radioed for emergency assistance. "My friend!" Jessica gasped, barely able to form coherent words. "She's hurt! I left her! I have to show you where!" But when Jessica tried to lead the search teams back to Sarah, she discovered that the markers she had so carefully placed were either gone or led to dead ends. The maze of streams and canyons looked completely different in daylight, with professional searchers, than it had during her desperate solo journey. For 2 weeks, teams of rangers, volunteer searchers and trained rescue dogs combed the wilderness areas where Sarah might have been. They found some of Jessica's markers, but the trail always went cold after a few miles. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging flew grid patterns over thousands of acres of forest and canyon country. They found nothing. The official search was called off after 14 days, though Sarah's parents continued to fund private search efforts for another month. Jessica spent every day she was physically able in the mountains, retracing her steps, trying different routes, following every stream and canyon that might possibly lead back to where she had left her best friend. But the wilderness had swallowed Sarah Chen without a trace, and Jessica Martinez returned to a world that would never make sense to her again. The years that followed were a blur of guilt and searching for Jessica Martinez. She never returned to her freelance design work, instead taking jobs with search and rescue organizations, wilderness guide services, and outdoor education programs. Anything that might give her another chance to find Sarah, or at least to understand what had happened to them in those mountains. She became an expert in GPS technology, studying every advancement in the field, hoping that better equipment might somehow help locate her friend. She learned about satellite imaging, ground-penetrating radar, and every other technology that might reveal secrets hidden in the wilderness. She took courses in wilderness survival, rock climbing, and emergency medicine, as if accumulating skills could somehow balance the scales of that terrible October. Every autumn, she returned to Rocky Mountain National Park, systematically exploring every trail, every creek, every canyon that might possibly connect to the route they had taken. She interviewed other hikers, studied weather patterns from 1994, and pored over geological surveys dating back to the early days of mining in the area. The park rangers knew her by name and tried to discourage her obsessive searching, worried that she was becoming a danger to herself. Her family staged an intervention in 1997, begging her to accept that Sarah was gone and to try to rebuild her life. Jessica nodded and agreed and promised to move on, but every free day still found her in the mountains, following another theory, checking another canyon. In 2001, she was hired as a wilderness instructor at a residential treatment program for troubled teenagers near Boulder. The work was exactly what she had dreamed of during that last campfire conversation with Sarah, using nature as a classroom, helping young people find strength and direction through outdoor challenges. She was good at it. Her students responded to her intensity and her obvious love for the wilderness, but everyone who knew her could see that she was still searching, still listening for some whisper of information that might lead her back to her friend. The breakthrough came in the spring of 2007, 13 years after Sarah had vanished into the Colorado wilderness. Jessica was leading a group of students on a multi-day backpacking trip in a remote area of the national forest, several miles from where she and Sarah had originally planned to hike. They were practicing navigation skills, using both traditional compass and map techniques and modern GPS units to compare the accuracy of different methods. One of her students, a 16-year-old named Marcus, who had initially been resistant to outdoor activities, was actually showing real enthusiasm for the technical aspects of wilderness navigation. He had brought his own GPS unit, a high-end model that his parents had given him as an incentive for participating in the program, and he was constantly experimenting with its features. "Ms. Martinez," Marcus called out during their lunch break on the second day, "this thing is picking up some weird signals, like it's showing waypoints that aren't supposed to be there." Jessica hurried over to look at his GPS screen. Modern units were capable of detecting and displaying waypoints and tracks left by other GPS devices, a feature designed to help groups stay together or to allow rescue teams to follow someone's route. But they were in an area where GPS technology was rarely used, miles from popular trails or camping areas. "Show me," she said, trying to keep her voice calm. Marcus manipulated the device's controls, calling up a display that showed several waypoints scattered across the local topography. "See, there's a whole route here, but it doesn't match any of the trails on the maps. And look at this. The dates on these waypoints are from 1994. Jessica's hands began to shake as she stared at the small screen. GPS technology in 1994 had been primitive compared to modern standards, but it had existed, and she remembered Sarah's excitement about her new Garmin eTrex unit, how proud she had been of spending her savings on the cutting-edge technology. "Can you tell where these waypoints lead?" Jessica asked. "Sort of. They seem to start near the main trail system and then head off into some pretty remote country. But Ms. Martinez, you look like you've seen a ghost." Jessica borrowed Marcus's GPS unit and spent the next hour studying the waypoints, cross-referencing them with topographical maps and trying to reconstruct the route they described. The pattern that emerged was both heartbreaking and impossible, a track that started near established trails but then wandered into areas that didn't appear on any current maps, following what seemed to be creek beds and game trails toward increasingly remote terrain. The final waypoints were clustered in an area that showed as blank space on most maps, a region of deep canyons and broken country that was generally considered too dangerous and inaccessible for recreational hiking. If Sarah had somehow made it that far, following the old mining trail that Jessica now realized they had never actually found, she would have been dozens of miles from where search teams had looked for her. That evening, Jessica called in favors from every search and rescue contact she had made over the past 13 years. She explained about the waypoints, provided GPS coordinates, and begged professional teams to mount one more search in an area that had never been properly explored. The response was mixed. Some of her contacts were skeptical about 13-year-old GPS data, pointing out that early units were notoriously inaccurate and prone to errors. Others were concerned about sending search teams into terrain that was known to be dangerous, even by expert mountaineers. But a few, who had worked with Jessica for years and respected her knowledge of the backcountry, agreed to organize a small, specialized search effort. The team that assembled 3 days later included some of the most experienced wilderness rescue specialists in Colorado. They carried the latest GPS technology, satellite communication equipment, and climbing gear suitable for technical canyon rescue. Jessica was allowed to accompany them, despite concerns about her emotional involvement in the search. Following the waypoints from Marcus's GPS led them away from established trails and into country that few humans had ever seen. The route was treacherous and often required technical climbing skills, but it was passable for experienced outdoors people, and it did seem to follow natural features that a lost hiker might reasonably choose. On the second day of searching, they found the first marker that Jessica had left in 1994, a faded red bandana tied to a pine tree, so weathered and sun-bleached that it was barely recognizable as human-made. The discovery confirmed that they were on the right track, and it gave the search team confidence to continue into increasingly difficult terrain. The final waypoint led them to a narrow canyon with vertical walls and a stream running through its center. Exactly the kind of place Jessica had described in her original statements to investigators. At the bottom of a 20-foot waterfall, they found the remnants of a camp, a collapsed tent, scattered gear, and the remains of what had once been a careful arrangement of supplies. And they found Sarah Chen. She had died not long after Jessica left her, probably within a day or two, most likely from complications related to her head injury. Her body had been naturally preserved by the cold, dry conditions in the canyon, protected from scavengers by the tent, and by the difficult access to the location. The GPS unit was still in her backpack, its battery long dead, but its memory intact, containing the complete record of their journey into the wilderness. Jessica knelt beside her friend for a long time, not speaking, while the search team respectfully worked around her to document the scene and prepare Sarah's remains for transport. After 13 years of wondering and searching and blaming herself, she finally had her answer, but it wasn't the answer she had hoped for. The investigation that followed revealed both the tragedy and the near impossibility of what had happened to the two friends. They had indeed found an old mining trail, exactly as Sarah had researched, but they had misidentified which trail it was. Instead of following a route that connected to the established park trail system, they had stumbled onto an abandoned prospector's path that led deep into wilderness areas that were not included on modern recreational maps. The GPS waypoints showed that they had traveled almost 30 miles from their last known position on established trails, following creek beds and animal paths through terrain so remote that it had never been systematically searched. Even if Jessica had been able to lead searchers back to Sarah immediately, the location was so inaccessible that mounting a rescue operation would have taken several days. The coroner determined that Sarah had died from a subdural hematoma caused by her fall at the waterfall. She had probably been unconscious or semi-conscious for most of the time after Jessica left and would not have suffered. The supplies Jessica had left with her were still largely unused, indicating that Sarah had been unable to care for herself after her friend's departure. For Jessica, the discovery brought both closure and a new kind of torment. She had spent 13 years believing that she had abandoned her best friend to die alone in the wilderness, that if she had made different choices or been a better navigator or had the courage to stay with Sarah instead of seeking help, the outcome might have been different. Now she learned that Sarah had been doomed from the moment she struck her head on the canyon wall. No decision Jessica could have made would have changed that outcome. Her desperate journey to find help had been futile, but it had also been the only reasonable choice given the information she had at the time. The GPS data revealed one final, heartbreaking detail. Sarah's unit had continued to record waypoints for several hours after Jessica left, showing that her friend had briefly regained consciousness and had tried to follow the creek downstream. She had made it less than half a mile before the head injury overcame her, but she had died trying to walk out of the wilderness, not waiting passively for rescue. The story of Sarah Chen and Jessica Martinez became a case study in wilderness search and rescue training, illustrating both the importance of proper preparation and the limits of even the best technology and planning when confronted with the vast indifference of nature. Modern GPS units now include features designed to prevent the kind of navigation errors that had led the two friends so far off their intended route. Jessica returned to her work with troubled teenagers, but with a different perspective on the nature of survival and loss. She still led backpacking trips and still taught wilderness skills, but she also talked openly about her experience, helping young people understand that survival sometimes means living with outcomes that can't be changed or fixed. She never stopped hiking in the Colorado mountains, but she stopped searching. The wilderness had finally given up its secret, and Jessica Martinez had learned that some questions, once answered, only lead to new and more difficult forms of the same grief. The GPS unit that had recorded their final journey was donated to a museum of Colorado history, where it sits in a display about the evolution of wilderness navigation technology. Visitors can see the small device and read about how 13-year-old satellite data helped solve one of the state's most persistent missing person cases. But they can't see the human cost of that technology, or the weight of 13 years of wandering, or the moment when Jessica Martinez knelt beside her friend in a remote canyon and finally understood that some trails, once taken, lead only to the place where all searching ends.